Caddis Maximus here, this time with just a quick review and comparison of sheet metal shears, otherwise known as tin snips. Now, I'm not a heating and ventilation technician, and I don't do much work with sheet metal, but I have collected up some tin snips over the years. When you do need to do some cutting on sheet metal, it is always nice to have heavy-duty shears, or they're really heavy-duty scissors for cutting sheet metal. We have a couple of different styles. We have a more modern styles, which are the small kind of compound hand plier size. We have a couple decent brands. We have a set of Stanleys, and then we have some Malcos here, which are real popular. They would be considered, as far as heating and ventilation, Malco tools are really very popular and a standard in that industry. We also have some traditional non-compound style sheet metal shears or tin snips, and what they are literally is just very large, heavy-duty scissors. We'll start off with this large set on the end. This is a set of Malko Tin Snips. These are kind of interesting because they have an aluminum body, so they are a bit lighter weight and a little bit easier to use. And I can certainly understand, why they chose that, because you're not cutting, heavy-duty, thick cross-section steel with these. They're made for a mild steel, very thin wall sheet metal, like heating and ventilation, perhaps automotive body panels. But that's something you need to consider with any kind of tin snips or sheet metal snips, is that they're all made for real light gauge material. And if you're working with stainless steels or alloy steels, such as automotive body panels, you really need to be careful to have nice sharp edges and to hold the shears real straight, because when it becomes stronger materials, it really wants to fold under the edge of the blades, and obviously in an aluminum set, that could be pretty damaging. Otherwise, these work great. It's really nice to have some of these shears when you're just trying to battle with heavy-duty packaging. They can really make it an ease, such as this kind of packaging here. Just having a nice big pair of scissors. Oftentimes you need to use two hands to operate them because they're so big. But as far as packaging is concerned, they're wonderful in that aspect. And that's one of the reasons I actually have a lot of these tin snips, is all the times I'm cutting plastics or other things. As far as having a large, heavy-duty pair of utility scissors, these types of things are great. The other quick aspect about these Malcos is that they have replaceable blades. And I do have some replacement blades, but I thought that was very smart. Not only did they integrate steel blades so they'd have a proper hardened steel blade, but at the same time you can just remove the bolt and just pop the two blades out and replace them. So they're actually quite useful, and they're actually pretty darn strong. Even with something like this, this would be considered a much thicker section. This is maybe about 15 thousandths, and it is indeed mild steel, but even something like that, these will work pretty well on. Next, we have a large Whis, which is a brand that this is the only pair of Wisses that I have, as well as some very large Crescents. Usually when people ask if I have a pair of heavy-duty scissors, I bring out these large Crescents. They weigh, 8-9 pounds. They're huge, but they are indeed very heavy-duty. Even doing that same cut that I did with the Malco when I'm using these, it's pretty darn easy. And it's pretty surprising, to tell you the truth. Excuse me, what's surprising is just how thick and oversized these snips are. So when I do have situations where I'm cutting thicker materials, or even like stainless steels, which are notoriously gummy and want to jam between blades, these tends to be the type of shears that I use. One other thing I did want to point out is that on sheet metal shears, the blades tend to not be straight. You can see, if this thing would, there we go. The blades have this curvature on all of these. You can see how it's not straight, and it curves down. This would be easier if I did it like this, matched up the points. Come on, camera. So there we go. You can see that it has that interesting curve, and that's so it maintains a fine point. When you're cutting sheet metal, you're not actually just shearing it off all at once. You're actually splitting the metal, and then the scissors or the shears actually just progressively move that slit throughout the entire cut. And so you always want to take care of the edge, because whenever you have dings or anything in the edges, then I tend to want to jam up, and it makes them much more difficult to use. So these Wisses, these are some V19s. They're just some smaller sizes of the very same type of pliers as these Crescents. They are a little harder to use just because we have a little bit less leverage, but that's just an idea of what the whisses would also look like. And as far as any type of shears or scissors, these would be the absolute heaviest duty ones as far as raw strength. A lot of these compound ones are very strong as well and are easier to use, but you get, you know, shorter depth of cut, you get not as much jaw opening, and just not as much overall absolute strength, of course, as just a big, heavy, multi-pound set of forged snips. And you won't find the Crescents anymore, but Whis is still very common, so is Malco. So those would be more of the professional brands of non-compound. And then what we have here is we have our Stanleys and our Malcos. So many people are aware of this, and there's many great videos on how to properly use tin snips. So that's why this is just a kind of a review and comparison of just different brands and styles, as opposed to a detailed use. There's some people who are very skilled with these. And how these tin snips or sheet metal shears work is they color code the handles so that it's easy to identify what type of shear you want, whether you need to go straight and make a left cut, go straight and make a right cut, or whether you're just going straight forward. And that's why they're known as reds and greens, and then occasionally yellows, but many times since you can cut straight with reds and greens, you usually just carry those two pairs. Now let me get out my little demonstration here. The reason you would want reds and, well, first let me compare these and I'll quickly demonstrate. So the difference between reds and greens would be the direction that the blades are mounted. So we can see here on the reds, they're hanging off to the left, and on the greens they're hanging off to the right. And the reason they're set up like that is when you need to make a turn and cut in the sheet metal, as you're cutting, what ends up happening is, say on these greens, which are designed to cut to the right, the reds are designed to cut to the left, is say on these greens you're trying to cut to this direction to the left. Actually, let me get out my demonstration here. As you're cutting, if you try to turn, what ends up happening is the bottom shear is pushing this part of the sheet metal up. I know this is cardboard, but it's about the same thing for this demonstration. So as you're cutting, the bottom turns this right-hand section to, am I getting this correct? Yes. I want to make sure I don't get confused here. So as you're cutting, it's pushing this section up. So if you try to turn to the right, this flange or this cut piece is going to end up hitting the top jaw, and it's going to bind up and not want to work. So the reason that these are right-hand cutting is as you cut, that piece comes up, and then so you can turn to the right, and that just follows this curvature on the left-hand blade. So you're able to snip and get a nice curved cut as you're going to the left. Obviously, if I try to go to the right, it just distorts it, and so that's the situation where you need some left hand, and which is kind of interesting that you'd use left-hand cutters to cut, or excuse me, you would use left-hand cutters to cut the left. I'm already confusing myself. It's been a while since I've used sheet metal shears. I really rarely use them. It's just so handy to have them when you do need to cut sheet metal. So, of course, on these, you would cut this way. And then, for instance, if I need to switch direction, I'd actually need to switch pliers so that I could get into this cut and then start to make it around the other direction. That's a real complicated cut. That would be very difficult in sheet metal, but that's kind of the idea of using reds and greens. As far as comparing these brands, I've always liked the Malcos a little better than the Stanleys. They both have very heavy-duty, high-strength blades. The Malcos are it's technically sheet metal, but it's plate steel, and it is very strong. I guess I never noticed that before, but it's actually a combination. This lower jaw is actually one forged piece. You can see that via the forging line here. And then this jaw is a bent-over piece of hardened steel plate, and so that seems to make sense. That saves a little bit of money and is still plenty effective. What's nice is that you get this nice smooth curvature on the Malco, so that kind of guides the flange of sheet metal along the pliers a little more effectively than ones that I would consider more traditional, such as these Stanleys. Another thing you'll notice in these shears is that they have very fine serrations. That's to prevent them from sliding off of the metal and to allow it to get a good grip so you actually get a nice cut. Stanley advertises as CRM, so I don't know if they mean chrome molybdenum or chrome moly. It's probably chrome moly, which I guess is molybdenum. But they just don't say CRMO, so that's kind of what I expect. So I'm not entirely sure what the Stanley blades are, but the Stanley blades are, both sides are forged. And quite frankly, I've had pretty good luck with the Stanleys and with the Malcos. For some reason, it always seems that the Malcos are just a little easier to operate than the Stanleys. And I'm not exactly sure quite why that is. I don't know if it's just a slight geometry change or just the way the blade ends up working. And I think it's a subtle difference in the geometry. And now let's see if I can get the camera to cooperate. There we go. So if we look at the Stanleys, it's just a standard shear, just like any of these big single action or single pin non-compound sheet metal shears are. But with the Malcos, there's just a subtle difference. And that difference is the way the jaws actually curve upwards from the pin instead of sticking straight or relatively straight outwards. These are both bent upwards. But the subtle difference on the Malcos is just the way the jaws overlap. I'm not exactly sure how to describe it accurately, but as you're cutting, this jaw isn't just going down. It also has kind of a sliding action. It's actually pulling this way a little bit, and I think that helps shear the metal a little better. So I did want to point that out about the Malcos. Is there just a slight subtle difference in how they operate, and it certainly makes the job a bit easier. So I definitely recommend the Malco brands, but they tend to be a bit more expensive than the Stanleys. One thing of note, and it's a big reason to have these big single actions, they do make long nose style of these types of pliers. But it seems even with how thick the teeth are, this set in particular, I've had many times when I've even been cutting open that heavy duty packaging and had to get caught in between these jaws. And once it actually spread them apart and I had to take this thing all apart just so I could bend it back because it bent at the pivot so they'd work again. And so I wanted to really point that out is the hand operated compound ones that have the long jaws do work pretty well. And the way sheet metal is if you keep the sheet metal real square or perpendicular to the cutting surface, you can shear surprisingly thick or heavy-duty sheet metal, where if you're cutting plastics or heavy-duty textiles, sometimes it will just fall in between the two jaws and they'll just get pried apart. And so that's always something to be aware of. And one of the reasons I did get these large ones is because they just have so much thicker, so much heavier duty of jaws than what, and if I can get this in frame, then what you can see right here, even these wisses about the same jaw length, but they just have a lot more width, a lot more thickness to prevent them from wanting to splay apart. So generally speaking, I would recommend against just about any brand of these long jaws, unless you're really strictly working with, like, you know, light duty sheet metal. Otherwise, if you're working with any kind of heavier duty sheet metal, then you really do need a heavier pair of scissors. And I'm going to go ahead and finish up this kind of funky, cringy review. Wasn't exactly sure what I was going to say and demonstrate when it came to these sheet metal shears, particularly since I'm not an HVAC technician, which is the type of person who would use these quite a bit. Is these Harbor Freight shears. These are sold as like heavy-duty utility scissors, which is a little bit weird because what they obviously are is just a heavy-duty set of sheet metal shears. And Harbor Freight has rebranded them. They don't have little serrations on the blades, but that would be the only difference. They're a large set of compound pliers. A criticism is that they have this stop set real early, so you can see the jaws don't open too far, and they have the stop set to where you can still grip it with one hand. This is something that's easily fixed since the stop is these notches right here. I'm going to take this apart and actually grind these notches down so that this will open wider. But I did want to mention that these Harbor Freights are, as far as all the Harbor Freight sheet metal shears, these are probably the best ones just because you get a lot of leverage off of them. And they have short, stubby blades. And they're not designed for left or right. They're designed just for standard straight cutting. But I always thought if I was going to recommend any of the Harbor Freight ones, it was actually going to be these. So if you needed a handy set for straight cutting, these are going to be pretty nice. And actually having the big oversized handles actually makes them pretty easy to manipulate. And I don't know if I mentioned, but the hardest thing about cutting sheet metal is actually getting the cut started. And that's what I mean. It kind of unzips the metal. So the hardest part is actually getting the cut started. Once you have it started, then it's not a ton easier, but it's surprising how much easier it is once you have the metal splitting, how you can just go along it and without a whole bunch of force just be able to continue to make your cut. And I probably should also show that oftentimes these scissors, when you use them properly and keep the metal square, really make a very nice edge. I mean, this edge is going to be razor sharp and you want to be careful of it. But these types of tools don't leave any kind of like real dings or ugliness on the edges of their cuts. At most, there'll just be a little bit of some teeth marks. I don't know if we can see it on this one here. You can see there's a little bit of some teeth marks of the corrugations from the Malcos and the Stanleys. But that's about the only thing you really need to worry about. And that's why I like these types of shears so much, is just because they're very heavy duty and you can do such a variety of work. And when it comes to certain situations, say you're modifying interior plastic panels in an automobile, those type of panels are notoriously difficult to really cut how you want to. And pairs of shears like these, when it comes to plastic materials, actually work great. And you can cut, dense, heavy plastics relatively accurately with these types of cutters. And so I did want to mention that. Anyway, that was just the end of a quick review and comparison of various types of sheet metal shears. Not the best or most descriptive of all my videos, but I felt that I definitely need to make a video about these, certainly concerning since I had a pile, and it adds to the breadth of the Catus Maximus YouTube tool database. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.